The tray hit the floor before anyone could stop it, and the sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the marble hallway like a warning bell. Edward Whitmore, the young Duke of Ashcombe, stood frozen at the door of his mother's chamber, watching the fourth meal in 3 days lie broken and wasted on the cold stone floor. His mother, Margaret, sat propped against a mountain of silk pillows, her face turned toward the window, refusing even to look at the mess. Her hands, once strong and steady, now trembled faintly in her lap. She had not eaten a proper meal in nearly 4 months, and everyone in the household had begun to fear the worst. The physician, Dr. Alden Price, stood beside the bed with his bag still open, his expression grim. He had tried everything medicine could offer. Tonics, broths, even gentle persuasion. Nothing worked. The Duchess would sip water when pressed, take a spoonful of soup if her son begged her directly, but anything more substantial was turned away with a quiet, firm shake of her head. It was not defiance. It was something deeper, something none of them could name, and it was slowly draining the life from her. Edward knelt beside the broken tray, gathering the shards of porcelain with his bare hands, ignoring the sharp edges that pressed against his skin. He had lost his father 18 months earlier, a wound that had barely begun to heal, and now he feared he was losing his mother too, not to illness exactly, but to something far more mysterious. Grief, perhaps, or something older than grief. "Your Grace," Dr. Price said quietly, addressing the Duke and stepping closer so the Duchess would not hear. "I have done everything within my power. Her body is failing, not because of disease, but because she will not nourish it. I cannot force a spoon between her lips. I can only warn you that if this continues, we may lose her before the year turns." Edward stood, brushing the porcelain dust from his hands, his jaw tight with the effort of holding back the fear that clawed at his chest. He looked past the doctor to his mother, who remained turned toward the window, watching the gray autumn sky as though searching for something that no longer existed. "Mother," he said softly, moving to sit at the edge of her bed, "please, you must eat something. For me, if not for yourself." Margaret turned her head slightly, and for a moment her eyes met his. There was love there, real and aching, but also something distant, something locked away behind a door that even she seemed unable to open. She reached out and touched his cheek gently. "I am tired, Edward," she whispered, "tired in a way that food cannot fix." It was the most she had said in days, and it chilled him more than her silence ever had. He held her hand for a long moment, then rose and left the room, unable to bear watching her fade any longer without doing something, anything, to stop it. In the corridor outside, the household staff had gathered in hushed clusters, speaking in low voices about the state of their mistress. The cook, a stern man named Barnaby Hodge who had served the Whitmore family for over 20 years, stood near the kitchen stairs wringing a cloth in his hands. He had prepared every dish he knew, from delicate consommes to rich stews, from imported spices to the simplest boiled vegetables. Nothing tempted her. He had even attempted to recreate meals from her wedding feast decades earlier, hoping some memory might stir her appetite. All of it sat untouched, growing cold on silver trays that were carried back to the kitchen in silence. "I have failed her," Barnaby admitted to the steward, Mr. Collins, who had managed the estate for as long as anyone could remember. "I do not know what else to try. I have exhausted every recipe I know." Mr. Collins placed a steady hand on the old cook's shoulder. "You have not failed her, Barnaby. Something deeper troubles her, something no dish alone can cure. But we cannot simply watch her waste away. The Duke will not survive losing both his parents in so short a time. We must think differently." Word of the Duchess's condition had begun to spread beyond the walls of the estate, carried by servants who whispered to relatives in the village, by tradesmen who delivered goods, and noticed the untouched trays being scraped into the pig troughs. The village of Hollowbrook, nestled at the base of the rolling hills that surrounded the Whitmore estate, buzzed with rumors. Some said the Duchess was cursed. Others whispered that she had seen a ghost the night her husband died, and that the ghost had taken her appetite along with her peace. The more practical among the villagers simply shook their heads and said grief did strange things to a person, especially to a woman who had loved her husband as deeply as Margaret Whitmore had loved hers. Inside the estate, Edward paced the length of his study, a room still filled with his father's belongings, untouched since the old duke's passing. Ledgers lined the shelves, and a faded portrait of his parents hung above the fireplace, painted in happier days when his mother's cheeks were full and her laughter could be heard through the halls. He stared at that painting now, searching for some clue, some answer hidden in the brushstrokes. "There must be something," he muttered to himself, "something we have not tried." A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Collins entered, his expression cautious but resolute. "Your Grace, I hesitate to suggest this, given how many skilled cooks have already failed her. But perhaps the answer does not lie with skill at all." Edward turned, curious despite his exhaustion. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Your Grace, that perhaps we have been thinking of this the wrong way. We have brought in the finest chefs from the city, men trained in the grandest kitchens, and still she refuses to eat. Perhaps what she needs is not grandeur. Perhaps she needs something simple, something that reminds her of who she was before she became a duchess." Edward considered this, his brow furrowing. "You believe a simple cook might succeed where trained chefs have failed?" "I do not know, Your Grace, but I believe it is worth trying. We have little left to lose." Edward was silent for a long moment, staring once more at the portrait of his parents. His mother had not always been born to nobility. She had come from humble beginnings, the daughter of a modest farming family before she caught the eye of the old duke at a village fair many years ago. It was a story rarely spoken of in noble circles, buried beneath decades of titles and formal portraits, but Edward remembered his father telling it to him as a child, with pride rather than shame. "Very well," Edward said finally. "Send word to the village. We will find someone new, someone different. I care not for reputation or training. I care only that my mother lives." Mr. Collins nodded and left to carry out the Duke's instructions, a small flicker of hope kindling in his chest for the first time in weeks. Whether this plan would succeed, he could not say. But doing nothing was no longer an option, not with the Duchess growing weaker by the day, and not with the Duke's own health beginning to suffer under the weight of his worry. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and cast long shadows across the estate grounds, Edward returned to his mother's chamber one final time. She was asleep, or pretending to be, her face pale against the white linens. He sat beside her for a long while, simply watching her breathe, memorizing the rise and fall of her chest, as though committing it to memory against some future he refused to imagine. "I will find a way to bring you back to us," he whispered, though he knew she could not hear him. "I promise you that." Outside, the first cold winds of the coming season rattled against the window panes, carrying with them the scent of wood smoke from the village below, where an answer to the Duke's desperate hope was waiting, though none of them yet knew it. The next morning, notices were posted throughout Hollowbrook and the surrounding villages, seeking a cook for the Whitmore estate. Unlike previous notices, this one made no mention of formal training or prior experience in noble households. It simply asked for someone willing to try, someone patient, and someone kind. The modest wage offered was hardly enough to draw the interest of established cooks, who scoffed at the idea of working in a kitchen where 3 of their peers had already failed. But for the poorest families in Hollowbrook, even a modest wage meant the difference between hunger and survival, and so the notice caught the attention of more than one desperate soul. Among them was a young widow named Alice Turner, who lived at the edge of the village in a small cottage with her 2 younger siblings, both of whom depended on her entirely since their parents had passed years before. Alice had never cooked in a grand kitchen, had never touched imported spices or rare delicacies. She cooked the way her mother had taught her, with whatever ingredients she could gather, turning simple vegetables and modest cuts of meat into meals that filled the stomach and warmed the heart. It was not fancy. It was not refined. But it was honest, and it was made with love, qualities that no amount of formal training could teach. When Alice first read the notice pinned to the board outside the village bakery, her heart raced with a mixture of hope and fear. She had heard the rumors about the Duchess, about the strange illness of the spirit that no doctor could cure. She did not consider herself skilled enough for such an impossible task, but she also could not ignore the wage that might finally lift her family out of the poverty that had gripped them for so long. "You cannot be serious," said her neighbor, an older woman named Ruth, when Alice mentioned her intention to apply. "3 cooks have already failed, Alice, real cooks, trained in proper kitchens. What makes you think you could succeed where they could not?" "I do not think I will succeed," Alice admitted honestly. "But I must try, Ruth. My siblings need more than I can currently give them. If there is even a small chance this could change our lives, I cannot let it pass by out of fear." Ruth shook her head but said nothing further, recognizing the quiet determination in the younger woman's eyes. A determination born not of confidence, but of necessity. The kind of resolve that comes only to those who have nothing left to lose and everything left to gain. That afternoon, Alice walked the long road toward the Whitmore estate, her simple dress patched but clean, her hands rough from years of labor but steady with purpose. As the great iron gates came into view, flanked by stone pillars and towering hedges, she felt smaller than she ever had in her life. The estate stretched before her like something from a dream, grand and imposing, utterly unlike the modest cottage she called home. For a moment, doubt crept into her heart, whispering that she did not belong here, that she would only embarrass herself and return home with nothing gained. But she thought of her siblings waiting for her, of the empty pantry and the winter that was coming, and she straightened her shoulders and continued walking toward the gates, unaware that within those walls, a grieving mother sat waiting, and that her own simple, honest hands might hold the answer that no trained chef had ever found. She was stopped at the gate by a guard who eyed her patched dress with open skepticism, clearly doubting that someone of her appearance had any business approaching the main house. Alice explained her purpose, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest, and after a moment of hesitation, the guard sent word ahead to Mr. Collins, who arrived shortly after to assess this newest applicant himself. Mr. Collins studied Alice carefully, taking in her modest clothing, her calloused hands, the quiet confidence in her posture despite her evident poverty. He had already turned away several applicants that morning, cooks with impressive credentials who nonetheless lacked the humility and patience he sensed the situation truly required. "You understand the difficulty of the task before you," Mr. Collins said, his tone neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply honest. "The Duchess has refused every meal presented to her for months. 3 trained chefs have already tried and failed. What makes you believe you might succeed?" Alice met his gaze without flinching, though her heart pounded fiercely. "I do not know if I will succeed, sir. I have no grand training, no experience in kitchens such as this one. But I have spent my life cooking for people I love with whatever little I had, and somehow it always seemed to bring them comfort, even in our hardest times. Perhaps that counts for something. Perhaps it does not. But I am willing to try if you will allow me the chance." There was something in her simple honesty that struck Mr. Collins deeply, a sincerity he had not encountered in any of the polished, confident chefs who had come before her. He nodded slowly, making a decision that would change the course of the entire household, though he could not have known it in that moment. "Very well," he said. "Follow me. I will introduce you to the kitchen and to the challenge that awaits you. I offer no promises, Miss Turner, only the opportunity to try where others have failed." Alice followed him through the grand entrance and down a long corridor toward the kitchens, her heart racing with a mixture of terror and hope, unaware that just beyond the walls she now walked past, a duchess lay wasting away, waiting, though she did not know it herself, for something far simpler and far more powerful than any dish a trained chef could ever prepare. The kitchen of the Whitmore estate was unlike anything Alice had ever seen. Copper pots hung in gleaming rows from the ceiling beams, catching the light of the hearth fires that burned steadily even in the middle of the afternoon. Shelves lined with jars of spices from distant lands stretched from floor to ceiling, their labels written in careful script that Alice could barely read. The air smelled of roasted meat and fresh bread, yet beneath it all lingered a strange heaviness, the scent of failure and frustration that seemed to cling to every surface after months of rejected meals. Barnaby Hodge looked up from his worktable as Mr. Collins led Alice into the room, his weathered face showing a flicker of surprise, then something closer to pity. He had expected another trained chef, another rival to prove himself against. Instead, he saw a young woman in a patched dress, her hands rough from labor rather than the delicate precision of professional cookery. "This is Miss Alice Turner," Mr. Collins announced to the small gathering of kitchen staff who had paused their work to observe the newcomer. "She will be attempting to prepare meals for the Duchess, beginning today." A young kitchen maid named Betsy exchanged a doubtful glance with another servant, and even Barnaby could not entirely hide his skepticism, though he tried to be gracious about it. "Welcome, Miss Turner," Barnaby said, extending a flowered hand. "I confess I did not expect someone so young, nor someone without kitchen experience in a house such as this. But if the steward believes you are worth trying, then I will not stand in your way. What do you know of cooking, if I may ask?" Alice shook his hand firmly despite the nervous tremor in her fingers. "I know how to cook simple food, sir. The kind of meals a poor family shares around a small table. I do not know how to prepare the fine dishes served in noble houses, but I know how to cook with care, and I know how to pay attention to what people truly need, even when they cannot say it themselves." Barnaby studied her for a long moment, something in her words striking a chord he could not quite name. He had spent 20 years mastering the art of noble cuisine, and yet none of that mastery had helped him reach the Duchess in her sorrow. Perhaps, he thought reluctantly, there was wisdom in simplicity that his training had caused him to overlook. "Very well," he said finally. "I will show you the kitchen, and you may prepare whatever dish you believe might help her grace. I cannot promise the other staff will make this easy for you, but I will not hinder your efforts either." True to his warning, the kitchen staff proved less than welcoming in the hours that followed. Betsy whispered behind her hand to another maid as Alice moved through the unfamiliar space, gathering ingredients with careful, deliberate movements. A young footman named Charles Whitfield, who had grown fond of mocking each new arrival brought in to solve the Duchess's mysterious ailment, made little effort to hide his amusement. "Another one," he said to a fellow servant, loud enough for Alice to hear. "This one looks as though she has never set foot in a proper kitchen in her life. She will not last the week." Alice felt the sting of his words, but refused to let them show on her face. She had endured far worse than mockery in her difficult life, and she had not come this far, walked this long road with hope trembling in her chest, only to be driven away by the cruelty of strangers. She continued her work in silence, focusing entirely on the task before her. She had decided, after much thought during her walk to the estate, that she would not attempt to recreate the elaborate dishes that had already failed to tempt the Duchess. Instead, she would prepare something simple, something warm and comforting, the kind of meal she herself turned to whenever grief or exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her own spirit. She selected a modest chicken, fresh vegetables from the estate's own garden, and simple herbs, intending to prepare a gentle broth with soft bread on the side, the kind of meal one might offer a sick child rather than a noblewoman. As she worked, chopping vegetables with practiced efficiency despite her nervousness, Barnaby watched from across the kitchen, his curiosity growing despite his doubts. There was something different in the way this young woman worked, an attentiveness that went beyond mere technique. She smelled the herbs before adding them, adjusting the quantities based on some instinct rather than a written recipe. She tasted the broth repeatedly, her expression thoughtful, as though searching for something specific rather than simply following a formula. "You cook as though you are listening to something," Barnaby remarked, unable to contain his observation. Alice looked up, a small, tired smile crossing her face. "My mother used to say that good food speaks to the heart before it ever reaches the stomach. I suppose I am trying to hear what this dish needs to say." Barnaby said nothing more, but he found himself watching her with growing interest, rather than the dismissive skepticism he had initially felt. By late afternoon, the broth was ready, simmered to a gentle golden warmth, accompanied by a small loaf of soft bread that Alice had baked herself, using a recipe passed down from her own mother. She arranged the meal carefully on a simple tray, foregoing the elaborate silver serving pieces that Barnaby offered her in favor of a plain wooden bowl and a simple linen cloth. "Are you certain?" Mr. Collins asked, eyeing the humble presentation with visible concern. "The Duchess is accustomed to the finest silver and porcelain, Miss Turner. This may seem beneath her station." "I understand your concern, sir," Alice replied respectfully. "But I do not believe her Grace's trouble lies in the presentation of her meals. I believe something else troubles her, something that fine silver cannot fix. I would like to try this first, if you will permit me." Mr. Collins hesitated, then nodded, recognizing something in the young woman's quiet certainty that he could not quite articulate but felt compelled to trust. He led her toward the Duchess's private chambers himself, wanting to witness this attempt personally, uncertain whether he was watching the beginning of a miracle or simply another disappointment in a long line of failures. Edward was informed of the new cook's arrival, and made his way to his mother's chamber as well, curiosity and cautious hope warring within him. He had heard from Mr. Collins that the newest applicant was unlike any of the previous cooks, a poor village woman with no formal training whatsoever. Part of him doubted such a person could possibly succeed where skilled professionals had failed. Yet another part of him, the part that remembered his father's stories of his mother's humble origins, wondered if perhaps this was exactly the kind of unconventional approach the situation required. When Alice entered the Duchess's chamber, carrying the simple tray with its plain wooden bowl, she felt the weight of the room's sorrow immediately. The curtains were drawn halfway, allowing only a dim gray light to filter through. The air smelled faintly of medicine and neglect, and the Duchess herself lay propped against her pillows, her face turned away from the door, her eyes fixed on some distant point outside the window, as though the world within the room held nothing worth her attention. Alice approached slowly, setting the tray down on the small table beside the bed with careful, quiet movements. She did not speak immediately, sensing that words might feel like intrusions in a space so heavy with grief. Instead, she simply waited, allowing the gentle aroma of the broth to fill the air, hoping it might reach the Duchess in a way that presence alone could not. After a long moment, Margaret finally turned her head, her eyes moving first to the simple bowl, then to the young woman standing beside her bed. There was no recognition, no particular interest, only the same weary indifference she had shown every meal for months. "Who are you?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Alice Turner, Your Grace," Alice replied gently, curtsying despite the informality of the moment. "I have brought you a simple broth. It is nothing grand, only something warm, made the way my own mother used to make it for me when I was troubled." Margaret studied her for a long moment, something flickering briefly in her tired eyes, perhaps curiosity, perhaps simply the novelty of a face she did not recognize. "You are not one of the usual cooks." "No, Your Grace. I come from the village. I have no formal training, only what my mother taught me." Margaret's gaze drifted to the bowl again, and for a moment, Alice thought she saw something soften in the Duchess's expression, a flicker of interest that had been entirely absent during the previous attempts. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished, replaced once more by the same distant weariness. "I am not hungry," Margaret said quietly, turning her face back toward the window. "You may take it away." Alice felt her heart sink, though she had prepared herself for this possibility. She glanced toward Edward, who stood near the doorway watching with barely concealed disappointment, and toward Mr. Collins, whose expression remained carefully neutral despite the evident letdown in his eyes. "Of course, Your Grace," Alice said softly, though she did not immediately remove the tray. Instead, she knelt beside the bed, bringing herself to eye level with the Duchess, something no previous cook had thought to do. "May I ask you something, if it would not trouble you too greatly?" Margaret's eyes flicked back toward her, surprised by the request. "What is it you wish to ask?" "I do not believe you refuse this food because you dislike it, Your Grace," Alice said carefully, choosing her words with great care. "I believe something else troubles your heart, something that no meal, however carefully prepared, can truly reach. I do not wish to pry into matters that are not mine to know, but I wonder if perhaps the food itself is not the true problem." The room fell into a heavy silence. Edward stepped forward slightly, unsure whether to intervene, while Mr. Collins watched with wide, cautious eyes, uncertain whether this bold approach would offend the Duchess or somehow reach her in a way nothing else had. Margaret stared at Alice for a long, unreadable moment, her expression unreadable before finally speaking, her voice barely a whisper. "You are the first person in months who has asked me such a question, instead of simply begging me to eat." "I did not wish to add to your burdens, Your Grace," Alice said gently. "I only wish to understand, so that I might help in whatever small way I am able." Margaret said nothing further, turning her face back toward the window once more, and Alice understood that the conversation, at least for today, had reached its end. She rose quietly, gathering the untouched tray, and offered a respectful curtsy before leaving the room, Edward and Mr. Collins following close behind. Once outside the chamber, Edward turned to Alice, his expression a complicated mixture of frustration and cautious curiosity. "She refused the food as she has refused everything else, yet you asked her something none of the others thought to ask. What made you think of it?" "Your Grace," Alice replied thoughtfully, "in my experience, when someone refuses to eat despite hunger clearly weakening their body, it is rarely about the food itself. It is about something the food cannot fix. I do not yet know what that something is for Her Grace, but I intend to find out, if you will permit me the time to try." Edward studied her for a long moment, weighing her words carefully. 3 trained chefs had come and gone without ever asking such a question, without ever pausing to consider that the problem might lie beyond the boundaries of the kitchen entirely. Perhaps, he thought, this young woman's lack of formal training was not a weakness after all, but precisely the quality that might finally help his mother. "You may stay," he said finally. "For now, I only ask that you continue trying whatever approach you believe necessary." Alice nodded gratefully, relief and determination mingling within her chest. As she made her way back toward the kitchen, carrying the untouched tray, she passed Betsy and Charles, who exchanged smug glances, clearly having overheard the outcome of her first attempt. "Told you," Charles muttered under his breath. "She will not last the week either." Alice said nothing in response, continuing on her way with quiet resolve. She did not know yet what troubled the Duchess so deeply, but she had glimpsed something in Margaret's eyes during their brief exchange, a flicker of humanity beneath the weariness, a sign that somewhere beneath the grief, the Duchess was still present, still reachable. Alice resolved that she would find the key to unlocking whatever door had closed within Margaret's heart, no matter how long it took or how many doubts surrounded her along the way. That night, as Alice walked the long road back toward her modest cottage, her mind churned with questions. What had happened to the Duchess to cause such deep and lasting sorrow? What memory, what loss, lay hidden beneath her refusal to eat? Alice resolved to learn everything she could about the Duchess's past, certain that somewhere within that history lay the answer she desperately needed to find. Over the following days, Alice returned to the Whitmore estate each morning before dawn, determined to understand the woman she had been hired to help. She prepared simple meals as before, small variations on broths and soft breads, gentle porridge sweetened with honey, delicate soups made from vegetables grown in the estate's own gardens. Each time, she brought the tray herself, sat with the Duchess for a few quiet minutes, and asked a small, careful question, hoping to uncover some thread that might lead her toward the truth. Margaret answered little most days, offering only silence or brief, weary responses that revealed nothing of substance. Yet Alice noticed something the others had missed entirely. On certain days, when the light through the window fell a particular way, or when the scent of wood smoke drifted in from the chimneys, the Duchess's expression would shift, however subtly, into something that resembled longing rather than mere sorrow. It was fleeting, easy to miss, but Alice had spent her life reading the quiet signals of people too proud or too broken to speak their pain aloud, and she recognized the pattern immediately. She began to seek out others in the household who might know more of the Duchess's history, particularly anyone who had served the family long before Margaret became a Duchess at all. It was through this search that she found Nora Whitby, an elderly nursemaid who had cared for Margaret since she was a small child in her own village, long before fate and fortune had carried her into the arms of nobility. Nora now lived in a small cottage on the estate grounds, retired from active service, but still occasionally called upon for matters too delicate for younger staff to handle. Alice found her one afternoon sitting outside her cottage, mending a piece of linen with careful, practiced stitches, her silver hair pulled back beneath a simple cap. The old woman looked up as Alice approached, her sharp eyes assessing the young cook with open curiosity. "You are the new one," Nora said, her voice carrying the rasp of many years. "The one trying to save our Duchess from wasting away entirely." "I am trying, ma'am," Alice replied respectfully, settling onto the small wooden bench beside the cottage door when Nora gestured for her to sit. "Though I confess I do not yet understand what troubles her so deeply. I hoped you might help me if you are willing. I understand you knew her Grace long before she came to this estate." Nora's hands paused their steady stitching, and for a long moment she simply studied Alice, as though deciding whether this young woman deserved the truths she carried. Finally, she set her mending aside and folded her weathered hands in her lap. "I have known Margaret since she was younger than you are now," Nora said softly. "Before she was ever a duchess, before she wore silk and jewels, she was simply a farmer's daughter, much like yourself, living in a small village not so different from Hollowbrook. Her family had little wealth, but they had warmth and laughter and love enough to fill every corner of their small home." Alice listened intently, sensing that she had finally found a thread worth following. How did she come to marry the Duke if her family had so little? Nora smiled faintly, a distant fondness softening the lines of her face. It was a summer fair, much like the one still held in the village today. The old Duke, young and restless in those days, wandered from the grand estate into the village celebrations, curious about the simple joys of common folk. He saw Margaret there, laughing with her sisters, her hands stained from berries she had been picking all morning, and he was utterly captivated. He returned again and again that summer, not as a duke seeking entertainment, but as a young man falling deeply in love. "And she loved him in return?" Alice asked gently. "With her whole heart," Nora confirmed. "Though it was not an easy path. His family disapproved fiercely of such a match, a farmer's daughter marrying into nobility. There were many who whispered cruel things about her, who believed she had somehow tricked or trapped the young duke into marriage. It took years before she was truly accepted within these walls, and even then, I do not believe she ever fully forgot where she came from, nor the sacrifices she made to belong here." Alice's mind raced, pieces beginning to connect in ways she had not anticipated. Did she keep any traditions from her old life? Any recipes, perhaps, from her childhood? Nora's expression shifted slightly, something wistful entering her tired eyes. There was one dish, a simple stew her mother used to make, using whatever vegetables and small cuts of meat were available, seasoned with wild herbs gathered from the hillside behind their cottage. Margaret used to prepare it herself in secret in the early years of her marriage, whenever she felt overwhelmed by the pressures of her new life. The old Duke loved it dearly as well, though he never spoke of it publicly, understanding perhaps that such humble fare had no place in noble circles. It became something private between them, a quiet comfort they shared away from the eyes of the household. "What happened to this tradition?" Alice asked, though she suspected she already knew part of the answer. Nora's face grew somber. As the years passed and Margaret grew more confident in her role as Duchess, she gradually set aside the habits of her youth, believing perhaps that she needed to fully embrace her new station to be respected within it. The dish was prepared less and less often, until eventually it disappeared from the household entirely, replaced by the fine cuisine expected of noble tables. I do not believe anyone has spoken of it in decades, not since long before the old Duke passed. Alice sat in thoughtful silence for a long moment, the pieces of the puzzle slowly forming a clearer picture in her mind. Do you believe her grief now is connected to this lost tradition, to the life she left behind? Nora considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe, child, that when the old Duke passed, Margaret lost not only her husband, but perhaps the last living connection to who she truly was beneath the titles and expectations. She has spent decades becoming the perfect duchess, and in doing so, I fear she buried the farmer's daughter who once laughed freely in village fields, who cooked simple meals with her own hands, who loved without the constant weight of duty and station pressing upon her heart. Perhaps she does not know how to grieve her husband without also grieving the woman she once was, the woman only he truly remembered and cherished. Alice felt a chill run through her, the truth settling into place with quiet, undeniable clarity. The Duchess was not simply mourning her husband. She was mourning herself, the person she had allowed to fade away over decades of duty and propriety, a person that only her husband had truly known and loved. Without him, there was no one left who remembered the farmer's daughter beneath the silk gowns and noble titles, and Margaret had perhaps forgotten how to reach that part of herself entirely, buried as it was beneath so many years of careful transformation. "Do you remember the recipe?" Alice asked, hope and determination mingling in her chest. "The stew her mother used to make." Nora studied her for a long moment, understanding immediately what Alice intended to attempt. "I remember it well enough, though I have not prepared it in many years myself. Are you certain this is wise, child, bringing such a humble dish to the Duchess's table? It may offend her, remind her of a life she worked so hard to leave behind, rather than comfort her as you hope." "I understand the risk," Alice admitted honestly, "but I believe it is a risk worth taking. Every fine dish prepared by skilled chefs has failed to reach her, precisely because they represent the very life she may be grieving the loss of connection to. Perhaps what she truly needs is not another reminder of her current station, but a gentle return to the person she was before all of this, if only for a single meal." Nora studied the young woman before her for a long moment, seeing in her earnest determination something of the compassion and understanding that seemed to have vanished entirely from the grand halls of the estate in recent months. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Very well, I will help you recall the recipe as best I remember it, but you must understand, child, that this could go poorly. The Duke may not approve of such a humble dish being served to his mother. The other staff may see it as an insult to the household's dignity. You are taking a considerable risk, both to your position and perhaps to the Duchess's fragile spirit as well." "I understand," Alice said quietly, though her resolve did not waver. "But I have watched her wither away for weeks now, refusing every fine dish placed before her. I do not believe caution has served her well thus far. Perhaps it is time for a different kind of courage." Together, they spent the remainder of the afternoon carefully reconstructing the old recipe from Nora's memory. A simple combination of root vegetables, a modest cut of meat, and wild herbs that grew freely on the hillsides surrounding the village, seasoned not with rare and expensive spices, but with the kind of careful, patient attention that only comes from cooking for people one deeply loves. Nora described the particular way Margaret's mother used to simmer the stew slowly over a low fire, allowing the flavors to deepen and meld together over many hours rather than rushing the process for the sake of convenience. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the estate grounds, Alice thanked Nora warmly for her help and made her way back toward the main house, her mind already turning over the details of how she might prepare this humble dish within the grand kitchen that had never before hosted such simple fare. She knew the other staff would likely mock her intentions, that Barnaby might hesitate to allow such a departure from proper noble cuisine, and that the Duke himself might question whether serving his mother something so far beneath her current station was wise or appropriate. Yet Alice could not shake the conviction settling firmly within her heart. She had witnessed something in Margaret's eyes during their brief conversations, a flicker of longing that no fine broth or delicate soup had ever managed to summon. Perhaps, she thought, the answer to the Duchess's deep and lasting sorrow lay not in the finest ingredients or the most skilled preparation, but in the simple, humble comfort of a life left behind, waiting patiently to be remembered. That evening, as Alice prepared to leave the estate for her modest cottage, she found herself passing by the study where Edward often worked late into the night, poring over ledgers and correspondence in his continued efforts to manage the estate despite his mounting worry for his mother. She hesitated at the door, uncertain whether to share what she had learned before attempting such a bold and unconventional approach. Finally, gathering her courage, she knocked softly and was granted entry. Edward looked up from his papers, his eyes weary but attentive, curious as to what had brought his newest cook to his study at such a late hour. "Your Grace," Alice began carefully, "I believe I may understand, at least in part, what troubles your mother so deeply. I wish to share this with you before attempting a new approach, one that I fear may seem unconventional, perhaps even inappropriate, given your family's current station." Edward set down his pen, giving her his full attention. "Please tell me what you have learned." Alice recounted her conversation with Nora carefully, describing the humble origins Margaret had come from, the secret stew she used to share with the old Duke in the early years of their marriage, and the way that tradition had faded and disappeared over the decades as Margaret fully embraced her role as Duchess. She explained her theory that Margaret was not simply grieving her husband, but perhaps grieving the loss of the woman she once was, a woman that only her husband had truly remembered and cherished. Edward listened in stunned silence, memories stirring within him that he had not considered in years. He recalled, faintly, the scent of a particular stew occasionally drifting from his parents' private chambers when he was a young boy, a scent unlike anything served at the grand, formal dinners of the household, and the way his father would sometimes hum contentedly afterward, a rare softness in his usually formal demeanor. "I remember that smell," Edward said quietly, almost to himself. "I had forgotten entirely until this moment. My father used to seem happiest, most at peace on those particular evenings, though I never understood why as a child." "I believe," Alice said gently, "that your mother has lost not only her husband, but the last person who remembered and loved the woman she truly was beneath her title. I wish to prepare that stew for her, your Grace, though I understand it may seem an inappropriate departure from proper noble cuisine. I believe it may be the only meal capable of reaching whatever part of her heart remains closed to everything else we have tried." Edward studied Alice for a long moment, weighing the risk of such an unconventional attempt against the growing desperation that had gripped him for months as he watched his mother slowly fade away. Finally, he nodded slowly, a flicker of renewed hope entering his tired eyes for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "Prepare it," he said firmly. "Whatever objections the household staff may raise, whatever risks this may carry, I would rather try and fail than continue watching her waste away without attempting everything within our power to save her. You have my full permission, Miss Turner, and my gratitude for the courage it must take to propose such an unconventional path." Alice curtsied gracefully, relief and determination mingling deeply within her chest. "Thank you, your Grace. I will begin preparations first thing tomorrow morning, and I will do everything within my power to ensure this attempt honors both your mother's dignity and her deepest, most hidden hopes." As she left the study and made her way home through the cool evening air, Alice felt the weight of the coming days settling heavily upon her shoulders. She did not know for certain whether her theory was correct, whether the simple stew from Margaret's forgotten childhood would succeed where every fine and elaborate dish had failed. But she believed, with a conviction she could not fully explain, that she had finally found the thread capable of leading the Duchess back from the depths of her sorrow, and she resolved to follow that thread wherever it might lead, regardless of the risks or doubts that surrounded her path. The following morning, Alice arrived at the estate before the sun had fully risen, determined to have every ingredient prepared and ready long before the kitchen filled with the usual bustle of the household staff. She had spent much of the previous night lying awake in her small cottage, turning the recipe over and over in her mind, trying to recall every detail Nora had shared with her, every small measurement and technique that might make the difference between success and failure. The kitchen was quiet and dim when she entered, the fires banked low from the previous evening, the air still carrying the lingering scent of yesterday's meals. Alice moved carefully through the space, gathering the simple ingredients she would need. root vegetables from the estate's own garden, a modest cut of meat from the cold storage, and a small satchel of wild herbs she had gathered herself from the hillside behind Nora's cottage the previous evening, the same hillside where Margaret's own mother had once gathered similar herbs decades before. She had barely begun preparing the vegetables when Barnaby entered the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes, surprised to find her already hard at work. He approached slowly, curious about the unusual ingredients spread across her work table, ingredients that bore little resemblance to the fine cuisine typically prepared within these walls. "What is this you are preparing?" he asked, his tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than the dismissiveness he had shown during her first days in the kitchen. Over the past week, he had come to respect the quiet determination and careful attentiveness Alice brought to her work, even if her methods remained unconventional by his standards. "It is a stew, Barnaby," Alice explained, continuing her careful preparation without pausing. "A simple dish, nothing like the fine cuisine typically served in this household. I have learned something of the Duchess's past, and I believe this particular meal may hold special meaning for her." She explained briefly what she had learned from Nora, watching Barnaby's expression shift from confusion to cautious understanding, as the pieces of the puzzle settled into place for him as well. He had served this household for 2 decades, yet he realized now how little he truly knew of the Duchess's history before she became the elegant, refined woman he had always known. "This is a considerable risk," Barnaby said finally, his brow furrowed with concern. "If Her Grace finds such a humble dish insulting, if she believes we are suggesting she return to some lesser station beneath her title, the consequences could be severe. The Duke has already lost his father. I would not wish to see him lose favor with his mother as well, however unintentionally." "I understand the risk," Alice replied steadily. "But the Duke himself has given his permission for this attempt. I believe with everything in my heart that this humble dish may be exactly what her spirit needs, even if it seems an unlikely remedy to those of us watching from the outside." Barnaby studied her for a long moment, then, to Alice's surprise, rolled up his sleeves and moved to stand beside her at the work table. "Then let me assist you, at least with the preparation. Whatever the outcome, you should not bear this burden entirely alone." Grateful for his unexpected support, Alice worked alongside Barnaby through the early morning hours, carefully following the guidance Nora had provided, adjusting seasonings by taste rather than precise measurement, allowing the stew to simmer slowly over a gentle flame exactly as Margaret's mother had once done decades before. The kitchen filled gradually with a rich, earthy aroma entirely unlike the delicate, refined scents that typically drifted from the estate's ovens, a smell more reminiscent of humble farmhouse kitchens than grand noble halls. As the morning wore on and other kitchen staff arrived to begin their daily duties, word spread quickly of the unusual dish being prepared for the Duchess. Betsy wrinkled her nose in obvious disapproval as she passed the simmering pot, exchanging a knowing glance with Charles, who had followed her into the kitchen to fetch supplies for the dining hall. "A peasant stew," Charles muttered, loud enough for Alice to hear clearly. "For the Duchess of Ashcombe, this will surely be the final embarrassment that costs this girl her position, and rightfully so. Such a dish is an insult to this entire household." Alice felt the sting of his words but forced herself to remain focused on her task. Refusing to let doubt creep into the careful attention she poured into every stir of the pot, every addition of herbs and seasoning. She had come too far, learned too much, to abandon her conviction now simply because others failed to understand the deeper purpose behind her unconventional choice. Mr. Collins arrived in the kitchen shortly before midday, drawn by the unusual rumors that had spread rapidly through the household staff. He observed the simmering pot with visible concern, understanding immediately the significant departure this represented from every meal previously served to the Duchess. "Miss Turner," he said carefully, pulling her aside for a private conversation near the kitchen's back entrance, "I have heard what you intend to serve Her Grace today. I understand the reasoning behind this choice, as the Duke has explained his conversation with you last evening. But I feel compelled to ask, are you entirely certain this is the correct path? The consequences of misjudging her Grace's reaction could be severe, both for her fragile spirit and for your own position within this household. I'm not entirely certain of anything, sir, Alice admitted honestly, meeting his concerned gaze directly. But I have watched her Grace refuse every fine dish presented to her for months, wasting away before our eyes despite the finest efforts of skilled chefs. I believe the problem was never the quality of the food itself, but rather what that food failed to represent. I believe she needs something that reminds her of who she was before duty and grief consumed her entirely, rather than another reminder of the station she currently occupies. Mr. Collins studied her for a long moment, weighing her words carefully against his own decades of experience within noble households. Finally, he nodded slowly, though concern remained evident in his expression. Very well. I will support your decision, Miss Turner, though I confess considerable apprehension about how this will unfold. I will accompany you to the Duchess's chamber myself when the meal is ready, alongside the Duke, so that we might witness the outcome together, whatever it may be. As the afternoon approached, the stew finally reached the careful consistency and depth of flavor Nora had described. The vegetables tender, the meat falling apart gently at the touch of a spoon, the wild herbs lending a fragrant, earthy quality entirely unlike anything else served within the grand halls of the estate. Alice tasted it one final time, closing her eyes as the familiar comfort of a humble, well-made meal settled over her, hoping desperately that Margaret might find within it the same comfort Alice herself had always found in simple food made with genuine care. She prepared the tray exactly as she had the first time, foregoing elaborate silver serving pieces in favor of a simple wooden bowl and a modest linen cloth, wanting nothing about the presentation to distract from the honest simplicity of the dish itself. Alongside the stew, she placed a small piece of coarse bread, baked using the same recipe her own mother had taught her years before, the kind of bread that filled humble cottages with warmth rather than gracing the tables of noble feasts. As she made her way toward the Duchess's chamber, tray held carefully in her steady hands, she felt the weight of every doubtful glance and whispered criticism from the kitchen staff pressing heavily upon her shoulders. Betsy and Charles watched from the kitchen doorway, clearly expecting to witness the final, humiliating failure that would surely end Alice's brief and unconventional tenure within the household. Even Barnaby, despite his growing support, could not entirely hide the nervous tension in his weathered face as he watched her depart. Edward and Mr. Collins were already waiting outside Margaret's chamber when Alice arrived, both men's expressions carrying a complicated mixture of hope and apprehension. Edward had changed from his usual formal attire into simpler clothing, as though somehow anticipating that today's attempt called for less pretense and more genuine humanity than the grand formality typically observed within these walls. "Are you ready?" Edward asked quietly, his voice carrying the strain of months spent watching his mother slowly fade away. Along with a fragile thread of renewed hope, he seemed almost afraid to fully embrace. "I believe so, Your Grace," Alice replied, though her own heart pounded fiercely beneath her calm exterior. "Whatever the outcome today, I have done everything within my power and knowledge to offer her Grace something genuine, something I believe may finally reach the part of her heart that has remained closed to us for so many months." Edward nodded, and together the three of them entered the dimly lit chamber where Margaret lay, as she had for months now, turned toward the window, seemingly disconnected from the world around her. The familiar heaviness of grief and neglect still clung to the room, though Alice noticed, with a small flicker of hope, that the curtains had been opened slightly wider than during her previous visits, allowing a bit more light to filter through the glass. As Alice approached the bed, the rich, earthy aroma of the stew preceded her, filling the chamber with a scent entirely unlike anything that had touched this room in months, perhaps in years. Margaret's nose twitched slightly, an almost imperceptible reaction, but one that Edward noticed immediately. his breath catching in his throat as he watched his mother's expression shift for the first time in longer than he could remember. Margaret slowly turned her head, her eyes moving first toward the source of the unfamiliar scent, then toward Alice, who stood quietly beside the bed holding the simple wooden bowl. For a long moment, the Duchess said nothing, her expression unreadable, and Alice held her breath, uncertain whether she was witnessing the beginning of something remarkable or the final confirmation of her theory's failure. The silence stretched on so long that Mr. Collins shifted uncomfortably near the doorway, and Edward felt his heart sink with each passing second, fearing that this attempt, like all the others before it, would end in quiet rejection. But then something shifted in Margaret's face, a subtle tremor at the corners of her mouth, a flicker of moisture gathering in her tired eyes that had not been present moments before. "That smell," Margaret whispered, so softly that Alice had to lean closer to hear her words clearly. "I have not smelled that in so many years." Alice knelt beside the bed, holding the bowl carefully, her heart pounding with cautious hope. "Do you recognize it, Your Grace?" Margaret's gaze remained fixed on the simple wooden bowl, her expression caught somewhere between wonder and pain, as though the scent alone had reached backward through decades of carefully constructed nobility and touched something buried far beneath. "My mother used to make this. A simple stew, nothing fine, nothing worthy of a duchess's table. How could you possibly know of it?" "I spoke with Nora Whitby, Your Grace," Alice explained gently. "She told me of your childhood, of the life you lived before you came to this estate. She helped me recall the recipe as best she remembered it, though I cannot promise I have captured it perfectly." Margaret's eyes filled with tears that finally spilled freely down her pale cheeks, the first genuine emotion Edward had witnessed from his mother in what felt like an eternity. He stepped closer, his own eyes glistening with a complicated mixture of hope and sorrow, watching his mother's carefully maintained composure finally crack after months of silent, hidden grief. "I used to make this for your father," Margaret said, her voice trembling as memories clearly flooded through her, memories she had perhaps kept locked away for years, unwilling or unable to face them directly. "In our early years together, when the household still whispered that I did not belong among them, when I felt utterly lost within these grand halls, so far from everything I had ever known. He would come to our chambers in the evening, exhausted from the demands of managing this estate, and I would prepare this simple stew for him, away from the eyes of the formal kitchens. It reminded us both, I think, that beneath our titles and duties, we were simply two people who loved each other deeply." Alice remained quietly kneeling beside the bed, allowing Margaret the space to continue speaking, sensing that after months of silence, the Duchess finally needed to release words that had been trapped within her for far too long. "When did you stop making it?" Alice asked gently, though she suspected she already understood the answer from her conversation with Nora. Margaret's expression grew distant, her eyes fixed on some point in the past that only she could see. "As the years passed, I grew more confident in my role here, or perhaps I simply grew more afraid of appearing anything less than a proper duchess. I convinced myself that such humble habits belonged to a life I had left behind, that I needed to fully embrace the woman I had become rather than clinging to memories of who I once was. I stopped making the stew, stopped visiting the village, stopped doing so many of the small things that once brought me genuine joy, believing they were beneath my new station." Edward stepped closer still, kneeling now on the opposite side of the bed from Alice, taking his mother's trembling hand gently in his own. "Mother, I never knew any of this. I never understood how much you sacrificed to become the woman this family and this title demanded of you." Margaret turned to look at her son, fresh tears streaming down her face, though her expression now carried something beyond simple grief, a kind of raw, painful honesty that seemed to release a burden she had carried silently for decades. "Your father was the only one who ever truly remembered the girl I was before all of this, Edward. He loved her still, even after all our years together, even as I transformed myself into someone he could proudly present at grand feasts and formal gatherings. When he passed, I felt as though I lost not only my husband, but the last living person who remembered and cherished who I truly was beneath every title and expectation. I did not know how to grieve him without also grieving myself, the person only he ever fully knew. The room fell into a heavy, emotional silence, broken only by Margaret's quiet weeping and the soft, steady sound of Edward's own breathing, as he struggled to contain the tears gathering in his own eyes. Mr. Collins remained near the doorway, deeply moved by the scene unfolding before him, understanding now the depth of sorrow that had gripped the Duchess for so many silent months. Alice remained patient and quiet, allowing this moment to unfold naturally without interruption, understanding instinctively that Margaret needed this release far more than she needed any further words of comfort or reassurance. After several long minutes, Margaret's weeping gradually subsided, and she looked once more toward the bowl of stew that Alice still held carefully in her steady hands. "May I try it?" Margaret asked softly, her voice still trembling but carrying, for the first time in months, a note of genuine curiosity rather than weary resignation. "Of course, Your Grace," Alice replied, her own eyes glistening with emotion as she carefully brought a small spoonful to Margaret's lips. The Duchess closed her eyes as she tasted the stew, and for a long moment nobody in the room dared to breathe, waiting to see how this crucial moment would unfold. When Margaret opened her eyes again, fresh tears gathered once more, though these tears seemed to carry something different than the sorrow of before, something closer to relief, or perhaps even a fragile, tentative joy. "It tastes exactly as I remember," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Exactly as my mother used to make it all those years ago before everything changed." She accepted another spoonful, then another, slowly at first, then with growing eagerness, as though her body had suddenly remembered what it meant to truly nourish itself rather than simply endure. Edward watched in stunned, grateful silence as his mother ate more in those few minutes than she had consumed in the previous several days combined, tears of relief now streaming freely down his own face, as he witnessed what felt like nothing short of a miracle unfolding before him. Mr. Collins stepped quietly from the room to inform the anxious household staff waiting below of this remarkable turn of events, and word spread quickly through the estate that the Duchess had finally eaten a proper meal after months of silent refusal. In the kitchen, Barnaby paused his own work upon hearing the news, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face, while even Betsy and Charles fell into stunned, humbled silence, their earlier mockery giving way to genuine astonishment at this unexpected success. Back in the chamber, as Margaret finished the last of the stew, she reached out and took Alice's hand gently in her own, studying the young woman's face with newfound warmth and gratitude that had been entirely absent from her expression for months. "You have given me something no physician or skilled chef ever managed to provide," Margaret said softly. "You have given me permission to remember who I truly am, beneath all of this grandeur and duty. Thank you, Alice Turner, for seeing what others could not." "I only listened, Your Grace," Alice replied humbly, though her heart swelled with quiet joy at having finally reached the Duchess after so many uncertain days. "The wisdom belonged entirely to you and to your own memories. I simply helped bring them back to the surface." Edward, still holding his mother's other hand, looked toward Alice with an expression of profound gratitude that words alone could not fully capture. "You have given me my mother back," he said quietly. "I do not know how I will ever properly repay such a gift. Seeing Her Grace's health and spirit restored is repayment enough for me. Your Grace," Alice replied sincerely, though even as she spoke the words, she could not help but think of her own siblings waiting at home, and the modest wage that had first drawn her to this impossible task, now feeling far less significant than the genuine connection she had formed within these walls. As evening settled over the estate, Margaret continued speaking with her son and with Alice, sharing more memories of her childhood, of the humble cottage where she had grown up, of the wild herbs and simple ingredients that had once filled her mother's kitchen with warmth and comfort. It was as though months of silence had finally broken like a dam, releasing not only grief, but also joy, nostalgia, and a renewed connection to a part of herself she had believed lost forever. Dr. Alden Price, summoned once word reached him of this dramatic change, arrived to find a scene entirely different from the despair he had grown accustomed to witnessing within these chambers. He examined Margaret carefully, noting with quiet astonishment the slight improvement already visible in her color and demeanor after just this single, meaningful meal. "This is remarkable," the physician admitted, genuine wonder evident in his voice as he addressed Edward privately outside the chamber. "I have treated grief in many forms throughout my career, Your Grace, but I confess I have never witnessed such a swift and profound change following what medicine alone could not achieve. Whatever this young cook has done, it has succeeded where all my efforts failed entirely." "She understood something the rest of us overlooked," Edward replied thoughtfully, glancing back toward the chamber where his mother continued speaking softly with Alice, a warmth in her expression that had been entirely absent for months. "She understood that my mother's illness was never truly of the body, but of a heart that had lost its connection to itself." As the night deepened and Margaret finally settled into a peaceful, restful sleep for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Edward remained by her bedside, watching the gentle rise and fall of her breathing with profound relief and gratitude. Alice quietly excused herself, understanding that mother and son deserved this private moment together after such an emotional and transformative day. As she made her way back through the grand halls toward the kitchen, preparing to finally return home to her waiting siblings after this extraordinarily long and eventful day, Alice could not help but feel a quiet sense of wonder at how completely the course of this household had shifted since her arrival just days earlier. She had come seeking only a modest wage to support her struggling family, never imagining that her simple understanding of comfort and connection would prove more powerful than the finest cuisine skilled chefs could offer. Yet even as relief and quiet joy filled her heart, Alice understood that this remarkable breakthrough marked only the beginning of a much longer journey toward Margaret's full recovery, both in body and in spirit. The Duchess had taken her first tentative steps back toward genuine health after months of silent suffering, but true healing, Alice knew from her own difficult experiences with loss and hardship, rarely followed a simple, straight path. There would likely be difficult days ahead, moments of relapse and renewed sorrow, and Alice resolved quietly to herself that she would remain patient and steadfast throughout whatever challenges still lay ahead, determined to help Margaret fully reclaim the life and identity she had so nearly lost entirely. In the days that followed, Margaret's recovery continued, slow but steady, like a garden gradually returning to bloom after a long, harsh winter. She began taking small walks around her chamber, then eventually through the halls of the estate, her strength returning gradually with each meal Alice prepared for her. Yet Alice understood, just as she had feared, that this path would not be entirely smooth, and it was not long before the first real test of Margaret's fragile recovery presented itself. Not everyone within the household welcomed this remarkable change with open gratitude. Among the kitchen staff, resentment simmered quietly beneath the surface, particularly from Betsy, whose cousin had been one of the trained chefs dismissed after failing to help the Duchess months earlier. Betsy had watched with growing bitterness as Alice, a village girl with no formal training whatsoever, succeeded where her own relative had failed, and this bitterness gradually hardened into something far more dangerous than simple jealousy. Charles, too, harbored his own resentments, having hoped that his own sister might eventually be considered for a position within the estate's kitchen, a hope now dashed by Alice's unexpected success, and the favor she had earned from both the Duke and the Duchess. Together, the two servants began quietly plotting ways to undermine the young cook's growing reputation within the household, hoping to see her dismissed before her position became too firmly established to challenge. Their opportunity arrived roughly 2 weeks after Margaret's initial breakthrough, on an evening when Alice had prepared a slightly more elaborate meal, encouraged by Dr. Price's suggestion that the Duchess's body was now strong enough to handle richer foods as she continued her recovery. While Alice stepped briefly away from the kitchen to gather fresh herbs from the garden, Betsy seized the opportunity to tamper with the dish. adding an excessive amount of salt that would render the meal nearly inedible, hoping to embarrass Alice before the entire household and cast doubt upon her abilities. When Alice returned and prepared the tray without noticing the sabotage, she carried the meal to Margaret's chamber with her usual quiet confidence, unaware of what awaited. Margaret took her first bite with evident anticipation, having grown accustomed to and genuinely fond of Alice's cooking over the previous weeks, only to find the dish shockingly oversalted, nearly impossible to swallow. Margaret's expression shifted from surprise to confusion, and Alice felt a cold wave of dread wash over her as she tasted the dish herself, immediately recognizing that something had gone terribly wrong. She knew with absolute certainty that she had not made such a significant error in her preparation, yet the evidence before her suggested otherwise, and she could see the beginning of doubt forming in Margaret's eyes. "I apologize deeply, Your Grace," Alice said quickly, mortification burning through her chest. "I do not understand how this happened. I will prepare something else immediately." Margaret studied her for a long moment, and though disappointment was evident in her expression, something in Alice's genuine distress convinced her that this was no simple case of carelessness. "This is unlike you, Alice. You have never made such an error before, not even in your very first attempts within this kitchen." "I do not believe I made this error, Your Grace," Alice admitted honestly, though she hesitated to voice her growing suspicion directly, unwilling to cast blame upon her fellow staff without clear evidence. "But I take full responsibility regardless, and I will ensure nothing similar happens again." Edward, informed of the incident shortly afterward, grew immediately suspicious, having witnessed firsthand the careful, deliberate manner in which Alice approached every aspect of her cooking over the previous weeks. He requested that Mr. Collins quietly investigate the matter, unwilling to simply dismiss such an uncharacteristic mistake without understanding its true cause, particularly given how much now depended upon his mother's continued trust in the young cook, who had already accomplished so much for their family. Mr. Collins, drawing upon his decades of experience managing the complex dynamics of household staff, began discreetly questioning the kitchen workers who had been present during the time in question. His careful, patient approach eventually uncovered a nervous, guilty admission from a younger kitchen maid who had witnessed Betsy tampering with the dish, but had remained silent out of fear of retaliation from her more senior colleague. When confronted with this evidence, Betsy initially denied any wrongdoing, but eventually broke down under the weight of Mr. Collins's steady, unwavering questioning, admitting to her actions along with the bitter resentment that had driven her to such a desperate and unkind act. Charles, too, was implicated in the broader scheme to discredit Alice, though his direct involvement in the specific act of sabotage proved less clear. Edward, upon learning the full truth of the matter, felt a surge of protective anger on Alice's behalf, understanding clearly how close this cruel deception had come to undermining not only Alice's reputation, but potentially his mother's fragile and hard-won recovery as well. He summoned both Betsy and Charles to his study, his expression carrying a stern gravity that neither servant had previously witnessed from their generally measured and patient duke. "You have both, through jealousy and resentment, nearly cost my mother the progress she has fought so hard to achieve," Edward said, his voice controlled but carrying an unmistakable edge of anger. "Miss Turner has done more for this family in a matter of weeks than any of you have accomplished in years of service, and rather than celebrating her success, you chose instead to sabotage it out of petty resentment. I cannot and will not tolerate such behavior within this household." Betsy, tears streaming down her face, offered a trembling apology, explaining the bitterness she had harbored since her cousin's dismissal, though she acknowledged the wrongness of her actions and the danger they had posed to the Duchess's recovery. Charles, too, offered a reluctant apology, though his tone carried less genuine remorse than Betsy's. After careful consideration, Edward decided that Betsy, given the severity of her actions and the potential harm they might have caused, would be dismissed from service, though he offered her a modest severance to help her find new employment elsewhere, unwilling to leave her entirely without resources despite her betrayal. Charles received a stern warning and a reduction in his duties, given the less direct nature of his involvement, though Edward made clear that any further behavior of this kind would result in immediate dismissal without exception. When Alice learned of the full situation, she felt a complicated mixture of relief and sorrow, understanding the resentment that had driven Betsy's actions even as she recognized the genuine danger such sabotage had posed. She requested a private audience with Edward, wishing to advocate, if possible, for a measure of leniency toward the dismissed servant. "Your Grace," Alice said carefully, standing before Edward's desk with quiet sincerity, "I understand the necessity of maintaining order and trust within this household, and I do not question your judgment in this matter. But I ask that you consider some measure of continued support for Betsy, if possible. I understand the pain of watching someone you love struggle, as she watched her cousin dismissed from this household. I do not believe her actions came from cruelty alone, but from a place of genuine hurt and fear for her own family's well-being." Edward studied Alice for a long moment, struck once again by the depth of compassion she consistently demonstrated, even toward those who had actively sought to harm her position within the household. "Your generosity toward someone who tried to undermine you is remarkable, Miss Turner. Very well, I will ensure Betsy receives a fair reference for future employment elsewhere, given your intercession on her behalf, though she will not be permitted to return to this household." Alice thanked him sincerely, grateful that her advocacy had at least softened the consequences facing the young woman, whose jealousy had briefly threatened to unravel everything Alice had worked so hard to achieve. As the days passed following this difficult incident, the remaining kitchen staff, having witnessed both the severity of the consequences and the surprising grace with which Alice had responded, began treating her with genuine newfound respect, their earlier skepticism and mockery finally giving way to sincere appreciation for her skill and character alike. Margaret, once the full truth of the sabotage came to light, expressed deep gratitude toward Alice for her honesty throughout the difficult situation, and her trust in the young cook, rather than being damaged by the incident, seemed to deepen further as a result. The two women had, over the preceding weeks, developed a bond that extended well beyond the simple relationship of mistress and servant, something closer to genuine friendship built upon mutual understanding and shared vulnerability. "You could have simply blamed the kitchen staff entirely, allowed harsh punishment to fall upon them without a second thought," Margaret said to Alice one afternoon, as the two shared a quiet cup of tea in the Duchess's now brightly lit chamber, the curtains fully open to allow warm sunlight to fill the room. "Yet you sought leniency even for someone who tried to harm you. This tells me a great deal about your character, Alice." "I understand what it means to struggle, Your Grace," Alice replied thoughtfully. "I understand the fear of watching those you love suffer, and the desperate choices such fear can sometimes drive us toward. I do not excuse Betsy's actions, but I understand them, and I could not in good conscience wish upon her a fate harsher than necessary." Margaret reached out and took Alice's hand warmly in her own, a gesture that had become increasingly familiar between them over the preceding weeks. "You have taught this household more about genuine compassion in a matter of weeks than decades of formal tradition ever managed to instill. I am deeply grateful, Alice, not only for restoring my health, but for the example of true kindness you have set for all of us." As autumn deepened into the estate grounds, the golden leaves falling steadily from the ancient oak trees that lined the long drive toward the main house, Margaret's recovery continued its steady, hopeful progress. She began joining Edward for meals in the grand dining hall once more, her strength and spirit gradually returning to something resembling the vibrant woman she had been before grief had consumed her so entirely. Yet even as her physical health improved, Alice sensed that Margaret's journey toward fully reclaiming her identity, the farmer's daughter buried beneath decades of noble duty, remained far from complete. One crisp morning in early autumn, Margaret surprised everyone in the household by requesting a carriage to take her beyond the estate grounds for the first time in nearly a year. Edward, though pleased by his mother's evident desire to venture outward again, could not entirely hide his concern. "Where do you wish to go, Mother?" he asked gently, watching her dress with more energy and purpose than he had witnessed in months. "I wish to see my childhood village," Margaret replied simply, a mixture of nervousness and quiet determination in her voice. "I have not returned there in over 20 years, Edward. I believe it is time I finally did." Edward insisted on accompanying her, unwilling to let her make such an emotionally significant journey alone, and Margaret, after a moment of consideration, requested that Alice join them as well, wanting the young woman who had helped guide her back to herself to witness this important step in her continued healing. The journey took most of the morning, the carriage winding through hills and valleys that grew gradually more familiar to Margaret as they traveled, until finally they arrived at a small village nestled beside a gentle river, quaint cottages with thatched roofs lining narrow, winding lanes. Margaret stepped down from the carriage slowly, her eyes filling with tears as she took in the sight of a place she had not seen in over 2 decades. "It has changed so little," she whispered, walking slowly along the familiar lane, memories clearly flooding back with every step. She led Edward and Alice toward a small, modest cottage near the edge of the village, its garden slightly overgrown but still recognizable as the home where she had spent her childhood. A young family now lived there, and though initially startled by the unexpected visit from a duchess, they welcomed Margaret warmly once they understood her connection to the home. Margaret walked through the small room slowly, touching the walls gently, tears streaming freely down her face as she recalled memories of her mother cooking over the modest hearth, of her father returning from the fields each evening, of laughter and warmth that had filled this humble space despite its lack of grandeur. She stepped out into the small garden behind the cottage, where wild herbs still grew freely along the edges, the very same herbs Alice had gathered weeks before to recreate the stew that had finally reached Margaret's grieving heart. "This is where it all began," Margaret said softly, kneeling to touch the herbs gently. "This is where I learned to cook, to love, to laugh freely without the weight of titles and expectations pressing down upon me. I had forgotten how much I missed this simple life, Edward. I had convinced myself that becoming a proper duchess meant leaving all of this behind entirely, rather than simply carrying it quietly within me." Edward knelt beside his mother, deeply moved by the raw emotion in her voice. "You do not have to choose between the two, Mother. You can be both the duchess this family and title require, and the woman who grew up in this humble cottage, who still remembers the joy of simple things. I believe Father loved you precisely because you never fully lost that part of yourself, even when you tried so hard to bury it." Margaret looked at her son with fresh appreciation, recognizing in his words a wisdom that echoed her own growing understanding. She turned to Alice, who stood quietly nearby, allowing this private family moment the space it deserved. "You helped me understand this truth, Alice, even before I fully understood it myself. Thank you for guiding me back to a part of myself I feared was lost forever." As they prepared to leave the village later that afternoon, Margaret insisted on visiting the small local market, wanting to purchase fresh herbs and simple ingredients to bring back to the estate, determined to continue incorporating small pieces of her humble origins into her daily life going forward. The villagers, initially startled by the presence of a duchess among their modest stalls, gradually warmed to her genuine interest and easy, unpretentious manner, many of the older residents recognizing her immediately despite the decades that had passed since she last walked these familiar lanes. An elderly woman running a small stall of dried herbs and spices approached Margaret with evident recognition and warmth. "Margaret, is that truly you? I remember you as a young girl, always laughing, always curious about everything growing in these fields. We heard you had become a great lady, married into nobility, and I confess we wondered whether you had forgotten this place entirely." "I nearly did forget," Margaret admitted honestly, tears gathering once more in her eyes. "But I am learning, slowly, to remember again, thanks to someone who reminded me that I need not choose between who I was and who I have become." The return journey to the estate carried a markedly different atmosphere than the outward trip that morning, Margaret's spirit visibly lighter, her conversation flowing more freely and warmly than Edward had witnessed in longer than he could clearly remember. She spoke animatedly of memories long buried, of childhood adventures and simple joys, occasionally laughing genuinely for the first time in what felt like an eternity to those who loved her most. Back at the estate, as evening settled over the grounds, Edward found a private moment to speak with Alice, wanting to express the depth of his gratitude for everything she had accomplished within their household over the preceding weeks. "I do not know how to properly thank you, Miss Turner," he said sincerely, as they stood together on the terrace overlooking the gardens, the last light of the setting sun casting a warm golden glow across the grounds. "You have given my mother back to me, and in doing so, you have given our entire family a chance at genuine happiness that I feared had been lost forever alongside my father." "I did very little, Your Grace," Alice replied humbly, though warmth filled her chest at his heartfelt words. "Your mother possessed the strength and wisdom necessary for her own healing all along. I simply helped remind her where to look for it." "You possess a rare gift, Alice," Edward continued, his gaze thoughtful and sincere. "A gift for genuine understanding and compassion that no formal training could ever teach. I have watched you these past weeks, not only restore my mother's health, but transform the very atmosphere of this entire household through your simple kindness and unwavering integrity. I would be remiss not to consider how we might properly honor such a remarkable contribution." Alice felt a flush of gratitude and humility at his words, though she remained uncertain what such honor might practically entail, given her humble origins and the vast gulf that separated her modest circumstances from the noble world she now found herself unexpectedly navigating. "I am grateful simply for the opportunity to help, Your Grace, and for the modest wage that has already meant so much to my family. I do not seek further reward beyond knowing that Her Grace continues along her path toward full recovery." Edward smiled warmly at her characteristic humility, having grown to expect and deeply admire this quality throughout the preceding weeks. "Nevertheless, I intend to ensure your contribution here does not go without proper recognition, Miss Turner. You have earned far more than you seem willing to accept for yourself." As the days continued to pass, Margaret's recovery deepened further, her renewed connection to her humble origins bringing a warmth and vitality to her presence that had been entirely absent during the long months of her silent grief. She began spending time in the kitchen herself occasionally, teaching Alice small additional details of her mother's old recipes that Nora had not entirely remembered, the two women forming an increasingly close bond built upon shared understanding and genuine mutual respect. The household staff, having witnessed this remarkable transformation firsthand, gradually shed their earlier skepticism entirely, coming instead to view Alice with genuine admiration and gratitude for the profound change she had brought to their entire household. Even Barnaby, the estate's longtime head cook, found himself genuinely grateful for the humbling lessons Alice's simple, heartfelt approach to cooking had taught him after 2 decades of focusing exclusively on technical perfection rather than genuine emotional connection. "I have spent 20 years perfecting the finest techniques known to noble cuisine," Barnaby admitted to Alice one evening as they worked together preparing the evening meal. "Yet you have taught me something far more valuable in a matter of weeks. Food is not merely about technical skill, but about genuine care and understanding for the person you are cooking for. I am grateful for this lesson, Miss Turner, more than I can properly express." As autumn deepened further into the estate grounds, preparations began quietly within the household for what Edward and Margaret both understood would mark a significant and well-deserved change in Alice's circumstances within the Whitmore household. A change that would properly honor the profound contribution she had made to their family's healing and restoration. One morning, nearly 2 months after Alice had first walked through the gates of the Whitmore estate as a nervous, uncertain applicant, Mr. Collins approached her in the kitchen with an unusually formal expression, requesting that she join the Duke and Duchess in the grand drawing room immediately. Alice felt a flutter of nervous uncertainty as she followed him through the familiar corridors, wondering what significant matter required such formal attention. She found Edward and Margaret waiting together in the drawing room, both dressed with unusual formality, their expressions warm but carrying a solemnity that suggested something important was about to unfold. Nora Whitby, too, had been invited, seated comfortably in a chair near the window, and Alice felt a surge of gratitude toward the elderly nursemaid, whose guidance had proven so essential to everything that followed. "Alice," Margaret began, rising from her seat to greet the young woman warmly, her health and vitality now fully restored after months of difficult recovery. "Edward and I have spent considerable time discussing how we might properly honor everything you have done for this family, and we have reached a decision we hope will meet with your approval." Edward stepped forward as well, holding a formal document that he presented to Alice with evident pride and sincerity. "Miss Turner, it is our wish that you accept the permanent position of personal cook and companion to the Duchess, a position that carries with it not only a significantly increased wage, but private quarters here on the estate grounds, should you wish to relocate your household, along with formal recognition of your invaluable contribution to this family's well-being." Alice stared at the document, her hands trembling slightly as she took in the generous terms outlined within it, terms that would utterly transform not only her own circumstances, but the entire future of her younger siblings, who had struggled alongside her through years of genuine poverty and hardship. "Your Grace," Alice said, her voice thick with emotion, "I do not know how to properly express my gratitude. This is far more generous than anything I could have imagined when I first applied for this position, seeking only enough wage to keep my family from hunger through the coming winter. You have given this family something far more valuable than we could ever properly repay through wages alone," Margaret said warmly, taking Alice's hands in her own. "You gave me back my life, Alice, my connection to who I truly am beneath every title and expectation. This is the very least we can offer in return." Nora, watching from her seat near the window, smiled warmly at the scene unfolding before her, deeply satisfied to witness the culmination of everything she had helped set into motion weeks earlier through her own quiet guidance and shared memories. Alice accepted the position with genuine gratitude, and within days, arrangements were made to relocate her younger siblings to a comfortable cottage on the estate grounds, close enough that Alice could continue caring for them personally while fulfilling her new duties within the main household. The modest cottage, though simple by the estate's grand standards, represented a level of comfort and security that Alice's family had never before experienced, complete with a proper hearth, sturdy walls, and a small garden where her siblings could grow their own vegetables and herbs. Word of this remarkable transformation spread quickly through Hollowbrook and the surrounding villages, carried by those who had witnessed Alice's humble departure toward the estate weeks earlier, uncertain whether she would find success or humiliation in her unconventional attempt. The story of the poor village cook who had succeeded where trained chefs failed, who had restored the Duchess's health and spirit through nothing more than genuine care and humble wisdom, became something of a local legend, inspiring hope among many families who had long felt overlooked and undervalued by the grand estate that towered over their modest lives. Ruth, Alice's skeptical neighbor who had doubted her chances from the very beginning, visited the new cottage shortly after Alice's family relocated, genuine amazement evident in her expression as she took in the comfortable, secure circumstances that had emerged from what once seemed an impossible, foolish gamble. "I confess I doubted you entirely, Alice," Ruth admitted, embracing her warmly. "I believed you were setting yourself up for humiliation and disappointment. I have never been more grateful to be proven wrong in my entire life." "I doubted myself as well, if I am honest," Alice replied, laughing warmly at the memory of her own nervous uncertainty during that first long walk toward the estate gates. "But sometimes, Ruth, the only way to discover what we are truly capable of is to try, even when every reasonable voice around us suggests we will surely fail." As winter settled over the estate grounds, bringing with it the first snows of the season, Margaret continued to flourish, her renewed connection to her humble origins bringing a warmth and authenticity to her role as Duchess that had perhaps been missing even before her husband's passing, and the subsequent months of silent grief. She began quietly supporting various charitable efforts within the surrounding villages, drawing upon her own experience with poverty and hardship to genuinely understand and address the struggles facing many local families, rather than simply offering the distant, formal charity typical of noble households. Edward, too, found himself transformed by the events of the preceding months, having witnessed firsthand how genuine compassion and understanding could accomplish what wealth and formal training alone could never achieve. He began taking a more personal, hands-on approach to managing the estate and its relationship with the surrounding community, remembering always the profound lesson Alice's humble wisdom had taught his entire household. One evening, as the household gathered for a warm winter feast to celebrate the changing season, Margaret rose to address the assembled staff and family members, her voice carrying a strength and warmth entirely absent during the difficult months following her husband's passing. "A year ago," she began, her gaze moving warmly across the gathered faces, "I could not have imagined standing before you all, healthy and genuinely joyful, having so nearly lost myself entirely to grief and sorrow. I owe this remarkable recovery to many people within this room, but most especially to a young woman who arrived at our gates with nothing but humble determination and genuine kindness, qualities that ultimately proved far more powerful than any formal training or noble tradition." She turned to look at Alice, who stood quietly near the back of the gathered crowd alongside Barnaby and the other kitchen staff, her siblings seated nearby, their faces bright with wonder at the grand celebration unfolding around them. "Alice Turner taught this entire household, myself included, that true nourishment comes not merely from fine ingredients or skilled technique, but from genuine care, patience, and understanding. She reminded me that beneath every title and expectation, we remain, at our core, simply people capable of great love and great healing, if only we remain willing to look honestly at what truly troubles our hearts." The assembled crowd erupted into warm applause, and Alice felt tears of genuine joy and gratitude gathering in her eyes as she looked around at the faces of those who had witnessed her difficult, uncertain journey from nervous applicant to trusted, beloved member of the household. Barnaby, standing beside her, placed a warm, fatherly hand upon her shoulder, pride evident in his weathered expression. As the celebration continued late into the winter evening, Edward approached Alice once more, his expression carrying a warmth and sincerity that had grown steadily throughout the preceding months of their unexpected partnership in restoring his mother's health and happiness. "You have changed this household forever, Alice," he said softly, watching as Margaret laughed warmly with several of the kitchen staff nearby, a sight that would have seemed utterly impossible mere months earlier. "I do not believe we can ever properly repay the debt we owe you, though I hope our continued gratitude and friendship might serve as some small measure of appreciation. Your friendship and your family's continued happiness are more than sufficient repayment, Your Grace," Alice replied warmly, watching her own younger siblings laughing and playing nearby with several of the estate's younger staff members, their faces bright with a security and joy they had rarely experienced during their difficult years of poverty. "I came here seeking only enough wage to keep my family from hunger through a difficult winter. I never imagined I would instead find a genuine second family, and the profound honor of helping restore such remarkable joy and health to Her Grace." As the winter months passed and gradually gave way to the fresh renewal of spring, the Whitmore estate continued to flourish under Margaret's renewed leadership, her connection to both her noble duties and her humble origins now fully and harmoniously restored. Alice remained a beloved and trusted presence within the household, her simple wisdom and genuine kindness continuing to influence not only the kitchen, but the broader culture of compassion and understanding that gradually took root throughout the entire estate. The story of the Duke's grieving mother and the poor village cook who restored her to health and happiness spread throughout the region, inspiring countless others to recognize that true healing and genuine connection often emerge not from wealth or status, but from simple, honest care extended freely between one human heart and another. And within the walls of the Whitmore estate, where sorrow had once lingered heavily for so many difficult months, warmth, laughter, and genuine love flourished once more, a testament to the profound and lasting power of compassion, humility, and the simple, honest wisdom of a poor cook who had dared to try where others had failed. A full year passed since Alice had first walked through the iron gates of the Whitmore estate, and the changes that single, uncertain decision had set into motion continued to ripple outward through every corner of the household and the surrounding countryside. Margaret, now fully restored to her vibrant former self, had become something of a quiet legend throughout the region, known not only for her renewed warmth and generosity, but for the unconventional wisdom she now openly embraced, having learned firsthand that genuine healing often arrives through the simplest, most unexpected paths. She had established, with Edward's full support, a small charitable kitchen within Hollowbrook itself, staffed partly by local villagers and overseen by Alice herself, offering warm, nourishing meals to families struggling through difficult times, much as Alice's own family had once struggled before fortune finally smiled upon them. Margaret visited this kitchen regularly, no longer content to offer distant, formal charity from within the walls of her grand estate, but insisting instead on genuine, hands-on involvement with the community that had shaped her own humble origins. Alice's younger siblings had grown remarkably during the preceding year, their earlier hardship and hunger now replaced by the security and comfort of stable, loving circumstances. Her younger brother had shown a particular aptitude for managing the estate's gardens, working eagerly alongside the head gardener to learn the careful cultivation of vegetables and herbs that continued to find their way into Alice's kitchen creations. Her younger sister, meanwhile, had taken a particular interest in cooking herself, often found beside Alice in the estate kitchen, eagerly learning the same humble techniques and recipes that had once saved a grieving duchess from wasting away entirely. Nora Whitby, whose quiet wisdom and long memory had proven so essential to Alice's initial breakthrough, had been invited to move into a comfortable cottage on the estate grounds herself, no longer needing to manage entirely on her own during her advancing years. She spent her days now sharing stories and recipes with Alice, ensuring that the rich history of Margaret's humble origins would never again be forgotten or buried beneath the weight of noble expectation, but would instead be cherished and passed down through the generations that followed. Barnaby, too, had transformed considerably during the preceding year, his rigid dedication to formal technique now balanced by a genuine appreciation for the emotional and personal dimensions of cooking that Alice had first introduced to the estate's kitchen. He and Alice had become close, trusted colleagues, each learning from the other's distinct strengths, and together they had begun training several younger kitchen staff members in this balanced, thoughtful approach to their craft, ensuring that the lessons learned during Margaret's difficult recovery would continue benefiting the household for years to come. Charles, who had received only a warning for his role in the earlier sabotage attempt, had gradually redeemed himself through consistent, honest service, eventually earning back the trust of both the household staff and the Duke himself. He often spoke, when the occasion arose, of the important lesson he had learned that difficult year, that jealousy and resentment ultimately served no one, while genuine effort and honest character always found their proper reward eventually. Margaret often reflected, during quiet evening conversations with her son, on how completely her understanding of her own identity had shifted since that transformative day when Alice first brought the simple stew to her chamber. "I spent so many years believing that becoming a proper duchess required abandoning entirely the woman I once was," she told Edward one evening as they sat together in the drawing room, the fire crackling warmly against the chill of the encroaching winter. "I understand now that true strength lies not in abandoning our origins, but in carrying them forward honestly, allowing them to inform and enrich the person we continue becoming." Edward, too, had grown considerably during the preceding year. His own understanding of leadership and compassion deepened significantly by witnessing his mother's remarkable recovery and the profound wisdom of the humble cook who had made it possible. he approached his responsibilities as Duke with renewed purpose, determined to ensure that the estate's relationship with the surrounding villages remained genuine and mutually respectful, rather than the distant, formal arrangement that had characterized his father's era of leadership. The story of Margaret's recovery and Alice's remarkable contribution continued to be shared throughout the region, inspiring other noble households to reconsider their own rigid traditions and assumptions about worth and capability. Several other estates, hearing of the Whitmore family's transformation, began seeking out unconventional talent from among their own local villages, recognizing that genuine wisdom and skill often emerged from unexpected places, far beyond the formal training typically valued within aristocratic circles. As the second winter since Alice's arrival settled over the estate grounds, Margaret organized a special celebration to mark the anniversary of that pivotal day when Alice had first brought the humble stew to her chamber, an event that had come to be celebrated quietly each year within the household, as a reminder of the profound healing that simple kindness and genuine understanding could accomplish. The entire household gathered once more, staff and family alike, sharing in a warm feast that included, at its very center, the same humble stew that had first begun this remarkable journey of restoration and renewal. "To Alice," Margaret said, raising her glass warmly as the assembled household fell into respectful, affectionate silence, "who taught this entire family that true nourishment comes not from grand gestures or formal tradition, but from genuine care extended freely between hearts willing to truly see and understand one another." The household responded with warm applause and genuine affection, and Alice, standing beside her now thriving siblings, felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the remarkable path that had led her from a modest, struggling cottage in Hollowbrook to this position of trust, respect, and genuine belonging within the Whitmore household. She had come seeking only enough wage to keep her family from hunger through a difficult winter, never imagining the profound and lasting transformation that single, courageous decision would bring to her own life, and to the lives of everyone connected to this once grieving, now flourishing family. As the years continued to unfold, the legacy of that pivotal moment endured, carried forward through the simple, honest recipes passed down from Margaret's mother, through the genuine compassion Margaret herself now extended freely to the surrounding community, and through the continued presence of Alice, whose humble wisdom had proven, in the end, far more powerful and enduring than any wealth, title, or formal tradition could ever hope to achieve. The Whitmore estate, once shrouded in silent grief and quiet despair, had become instead a place of genuine warmth, laughter, and enduring hope, a living testament to the simple, profound truth that healing often arrives not through grandeur, but through the quiet, patient kindness of those willing to truly listen and understand.